Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Focus for today's video is the magical mystery tour that is game stutters, specifically in sim racing titles. Now, stuttering is quite a general term. I'm using it in the context of any interruption in smooth gameplay. Could be a micro stutter that you hardly notice. Could be a longer stutter where you feel there's a bit of a gap between your input into the game and then what you actually see rendered on the screen. But over the last 2-3 years, as I've upgraded my system, added hardware, changed software, added companion apps, all of that good stuff, I found that just trying to find the root cause of stutters can honestly just drive you to madness. Now, there is some great content out there already on YouTube. There are a number of YouTubers that I follow that have identified stutters in their game and have been able to do kind of the root cause for them specifically, which is awesome. What I've struggled to find though, and the reason why I'm putting out this video, is more of a comprehensive guide. My take on stutters is it will be a never-ending journey. Hopefully, for 90% of your sim racing, you're not getting any at all. That's fantastic. But every time you introduce new hardware, change software, Windows update, whatever it might be, there's always a chance that that change in environmental conditions can impact, a CPU stutter, GPU stutter, RAM, whatever it might be, and then just really spoil that gameplay experience. So the purpose of this video is to give you a sense of all of the potential areas on your system that can cause a stutter. Hardware, software, whatever it might be. I'll take you down a little rabbit hole on each one, talk about what to look for, how to identify it, how to diagnose it, and then I'll give you some guidance in terms of things that you can try to see if it resolves the stuttering. As I said, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. Stuttering, I've gone through periods where game has been super smooth, months at a time, no worries, forgot stutters even existed, to periods where I have really struggled with it and it was, impacting my gameplay. Could argue it was slowing me down, but I found it really, really frustrating, to the point where I was rebuilding my PC a couple of times a month to just see if I could get rid of the challenges. So I'm going to talk you through, as I said, the different areas that I think can cause stutters, right the way through from the BIOS into Windows, into hardware selection, give you some guidance around things you can look at to change, and then hopefully at the end of it, if you are struggling with stutters in certain areas, you'll at least have a good idea of where to look, what to probe for, and even if you're not struggling with stutters, they will probably arrive at some point in your sim racing career, and if they do, this video should serve as a reasonable guide as to where to look to try and isolate the issue, and then hopefully to get on top of it. So when it comes to monitoring apps, let's first of all just take a look at the ones that are inbuilt to Windows. Some of these can be quite useful, and also, they're running in the background, so you don't need to install extra software. Probably the most obvious is Task Manager. Now, this is first screen it'll normally load to will be the processes and apps that are running. Useful if you want to get a sense of how much CPU or memory is being allocated to the various apps you've got running whilst you are in the sim, or how much disk or network activity is taking place. So it's kind of real time, but this isn't doing any reporting for you, it's just showing you current state usage. I will often jump into the following tab, which is called Performance. And this is where you get a breakdown of all of your major components of your PC: CPU, memory, disk, Ethernet, GPU. Good first place to come, really easy to check in terms of current CPU utilization. You can see I've got all of the cores listed here. Now, if for yours you're not seeing all of the cores, it's probably just because you've got overall utilization. I like to see the logical processes so I can see the different cores and how they're being used. Basic information at the bottom, make sure that it's recognizing the actual processor. Who knows, poor install or buying something, off a website that you thought was a processor and maybe wasn't. You never know, you've got to check for all possibilities. But you see the utilization here, you can see the speed that it's running at. Again, it's just point in time. So we're running at 5.2, which is great. The base speed is 4.7. I know that's accurate for this particular processor. And it also shows the cache that the Windows is recognizing recognizing all the way up to 96 megabytes for this particular processor. So you can't get a ton of information from this, but you can at least check that it is indeed the right CPU that you thought you bought, the current speed it's running, current utilization, and the base speed and the cache. Jumping into memory, maybe a touch more useful. Double check that Windows is recognizing the RAM that you have. I recently moved from 32 to 64. Recognized. Excellent. You can get a quick view here around what's in use, what's committed, and what's therefore remaining and available. I, of course, don't have iRacing running, so there's plenty available at the moment. But again, useful to check that the EXPO or XMP profile you've set in your BIOS is showing up here in terms of the speed. I can see that that's right for me. 4800 would be the stock profile. 6000 is the EXPO profile for these sticks. 2 out of 4. I've got 2 RAM sticks in. That makes sense. And so again, you can't do much with this, but it's almost just confirming that the setup of your system is as you expect it. Disk usage can be useful. I don't tend to look at this all that often, to be honest. Having a good performing SSD, of course, is important, but I don't tend to use this to get much data from. Similarly for Ethernet or Wi-Fi, if you're on, you can see kind of the speed you're getting, but there's other and better ways to test that. Speed test that, for example, on a web browser can do a good job. And then finally, you can get into the GPU. Some decent information in here. 3D. So when you're playing, the usage of this will typically be very high. If it's particularly low, then it's probably because you are CPU bottlenecked. If you're doing a bunch of video encoding, you'll be able to see this here. And you can also see how much GPU memory is dedicated and how much is available. So again, not tons of information, but this is the first place I'll often go just to get the absolute basics for the system, especially if I've installed some new components. Make sure that Windows is recognizing them and then they're showing up here accurately. The next one, which I have really only recently come across and started to use a little bit more, again, Windows app called Resource Monitor. Now I'm going to make this full screen here, and I do appreciate that some of the text is small, but really the most important part here will be the graphs on the right hand side. If you look at the top here, you've got overview, CPU, memory, disk, network. It's of course pulling from the same information from the task manager that we were just looking at, but you just get it in a slightly different format. I generally come to Resource Monitor to double check if I've swapped out my CPU or made any significant hardware changes, that I don't have any cores that are currently parked. Now, parked cores we'll get onto in a later part of this video. There's a bit of a thing out there right now that parking cores is bad for gaming as a general rule, and that's not necessarily accurate. It very much depends on the makeup of your processor and whether it has performance cores and efficiency cores. If from an Intel perspective, you often will want the efficiency cores parked, so all of the power and energy is going to the performance cores. And similarly with AMD, I have a 9800 X3D with a single CCD, so I indeed don't want any cores parked because they can all access the cache, so I want them all available, running as fast as they can. But if you are running an AMD processor which has more cores and therefore has 2 CCDs, only one of those CCDs, and therefore half the cores, can access that extra cache, and therefore you want that one CCD really to be parked whilst you're gaming, so that all of the energy and power can be focused on the one that has access to the cache. So it's certainly true that having parked cores can cause challenges in terms of stuttering and latency issues, but it is very processor design specific. So before you come in here, see your park cores and then go learn how to unpark them, just make sure that is indeed the right behavior to give you more performance in your games. As I said, for my example, it is. And in fact, I have not needed to unpark cores. I'm running the latest drivers from AMD, and I think that automatically keeps the cores active at all times. But, it's an area to take a look at. So Resource Monitor, very good for just double checking if you've got part cores at any point in time. If you have got part cores, you will just see it noted next to each of these CPUs, and they're often grayed out as well. You will never have all cores parked, of course, otherwise the PC wouldn't be running. So you'll have a few that are active at the top, but you may well have part cores down the bottom. So you can see for me, all cores active all the time, so that's great. You can get a bit more visual information, I guess, on the memory, but it's still very similar to Task Manager. What's the hardware reserve portion? What's in use currently? What is standby RAM ready to go, and what do you have free and available? Of course, if I had a sim running, I would have a lot less free, as the sim would be reserving a lot more of the RAM to be used. So this can be useful. And again, just like Task Manager, you have disk and network. So as I said, I generally use Resource Monitor as a double check that I'm not getting any part cores. And then on memory, the other graph that I find quite useful is this hard faults per second, or these can also be called page faults. That's something that the iRacing Resource Monitor can also show you in game. There's a little graph can show you if you're getting a ton of page faults. Page faults are when there is not enough RAM available, and therefore the system has to use the SSD or hard drive in order to kind of swap information instead of pulling it directly from RAM. That in itself can, in some situations, lead to stuttering. So if you are seeing an extremely high number of page faults or hard faults, as you see here whilst you're gaming, then that could be the cause of the stuttering, and therefore it may be because you either don't have enough RAM, perhaps the RAM's incompatible, perhaps it's running at too slow a speed, but it generally will indicate potentially a RAM capacity issue. So Resource Monitor, good to looking at CPU part cores, quite useful to checking on page faults or hard faults per second for the memory as well. Now, I've talked about this one on a number of my other videos, as it's a bit of a favorite of mine, just to diagnose system issues, and it's another Windows app called Event Viewer. This is great because it's a constant log of any errors or warnings that the system is throwing whilst it's active. So once it boots up, you generally just get to this Event Viewer local summary of admin events. And the one you want to focus on is error category. You could take a look at the warnings, but generally it's a warning. There's no sort of system issues caused by that. Once you get into this error bucket, there is potential that because the system has thrown an error, that again could be the cause of a particular stutter. Now, you're never going to have a system that is running with 0 errors. Just the way a system runs, it's always finding, something goes wrong and it fixes that. A lot of it is by design, so it's not really something you need to worry about. You don't need to come in here and look to try and diagnose and resolve every single error source. But it is worth getting familiar with the most common errors that you're seeing whilst you're gaming, just in case that is something that can be fixed and actually shouldn't be happening. Now, I have a relatively short list here, and these errors are all familiar to me. For whatever reason, I always get this driver Logitech error, maybe because of poor software, maybe for something else, does not impact gameplay. And you can see in the last 7 days, only had that once, so it's not a particularly common one. This one, error setting traits on provider, done some research. I think it's to do with the USB on my headset. Again, no real issue, doesn't impact gaming, but appears every time I kind of switch on the system. This TPM one for me, something around secure boot update. I think this has actually been solved in a recent Windows update, because as you can see, I've had one in the last 7 days, and I was typically getting this every time I booted the system, so hopefully that's going to disappear. And distributed COM, these always seem to appear, and again, no real impact for gaming. So this isn't something I'm particularly worried about. The one that I've actually emailed iRacing support about in the past is this particular one, and that's because this error gets generated a high number of times every time I'm in the sim doing iRacing, and it only happens when I'm in the sim, and I think it's to do with the anti-cheat software. So I was concerned for a period of time that these errors were happening so often whilst racing that they could be causing stuttering. To be honest, still a mild concern of mine. So I sent error reports to iRacing. They've kind of come back, told me there's nothing really to worry about. I've looked online with this error code, and it seems that the easy anti-cheat, this generates this error, and that this error happens across multiple games. it's difficult for me to know if this is a big deal or not. I don't think it's contributing to any stuttering that I've had in the past couple of months. Still would rather this wasn't there because it's very specifically happening when I'm racing. But again, even so, I'm racing on fine at the moment, so I'm not too worried about it. But Event Viewer, very useful, keeps a log of all the errors, and in particular, you don't have to have Event Viewer running whilst you're in the sim. You can do a session in the sim, and then you can come back, and then you can see, okay, well, in the last hour that I was in the sim, what were the errors that I was getting? Get familiar with them, do a Google search, and then if you think there's something that's happening that shouldn't be, then, email the support for your particular sim, get on Reddit, get on any of your trusted sources, and just see if it's something to resolve. As I said, a lot of times you'll get a handful of errors, nothing to worry about, but if you're familiar with them, and especially the ones that reappear every time you're in the sim, it can point to a potential area of failure that you can get in, can address, and potentially resolve one aspect of stuttering. Okay, a couple of other third-party apps just to chat about real quickly before we close out this section. The first one is one that I use from time to time called HWiNFO 64. So I'm just booting it up here. There's a free version and a paid version. Both work great. I ran the paid version for a little while last year when I was really getting into overclocking, trying to really understand all bits of the system. The free version, though, still reports on all of the same components of your PC and works absolutely great. It's always good to contribute to the developers behind these apps, though, especially when they have a free version. So the one thing to know about any third-party monitoring apps, if you have them up and running whilst you're running the sim, they themselves will take resources. So you don't typically want to run a sim race when you have these programs active. They're going to impact performance. However, if you are trying to diagnose a stutter or just get a sense of, what are your temps when you're running a particular sim? Are you GPU bottlenecked? So you want to check the utilization of the CPU, the GPU. Do you want to take a look at if you're getting any Windows hardware errors? You can see that's right down the bottom here. This can be a great thing to do. So as I said, I would not recommend running these full time, but in a practice race, when you're just trying to test out the system, understand how it's performing, this HWiNFO, and there are other competitors, can be very useful to do. To give you a quick run through of what do I look for, I'll take a quick look at the core clocks here, just to make sure, am I getting the clocks that I'm expecting? So I have my CPU currently overclocked to 5.3 using PBO, and indeed this core clock's at 5.3. Now the core effective clocks is basically the actual effective clock it's reaching. All of them are quite low at the moment because I'm not pushing the CPU. I don't have a game running. But by looking at the core clocks, you can see the top frequency that it should reach under load. So all good. You can take a look at C-state residency, it's called. Now, we talked about C-states a little bit earlier, and as I said, I'm not a complete expert, but because I have C-states disabled, you'll see that none of my cores drop into C6 residency, and this state is called the deep power down state. I like that because that means I don't ever have to wake any of the cores up, even though most of the time you should never be able to see or feel that impact on your system. So my cores are basically either in C0, so full on, or in C1 state, which is called auto halt, which I guess is like an idle state. And again, you can do the drop down, you can see exactly what's happening with your core. Most of mine, of course, are set into C1 residency. If I was running a game, I'd have at least 2 or 3 of the cores that would be really in C0, getting fully utilized. Memory timings, again, you can generally see this using Windows, Task Manager, etc., but you can check here what your memory clocks, are they running with the overclock that you expect? So mine are running here at 3000 megahertz, which 6000 mega transfers per second, so all good. And then really anything that your motherboard, CPU or GPU can report is picked up by the app. So this is the big section on CPU. You can see temperatures here. You can see the power limits just down here, how much are we using. Mine is set to motherboard, so I of course have tons of headroom in terms of the power limits. You can see how much of the thermal limit you're hitting. So you've got the current, the minimum, the maximum. So I'm about half the thermal limit, which makes sense. I think the thermal limit for this CPU is around 80 or 90 degrees, and I'm running at just under half that at the moment. And then you can scroll through, you can see your fans, you can see voltage, more information in here than I would ever use. But getting down right to the bottom, you can see your GPU temperatures, and again another area that I'll take a look at, especially when you're running triple screens. You want to understand just how hot is the system getting, and then are you getting any potential throttling from a particular area. And you can also see fan speeds, etc. So HWiNFO 64 or indeed competitor apps can be really good. This is the one that I have used most. As a reminder, wouldn't have this set to run all of the time when you're gaming, but when you're doing a session to try and identify issues or just understand how your system is performing with a particular sim or after a hardware or software change, a great way to do that and to get a full information kind of about your system whilst you're running the sim. So let's have a chat about the BIOS and some settings that you can take a look at if you are struggling with stuttering, and things just to make note of or get a bit more familiar with for the setup of your system. The first thing is pretty obvious. Make sure you're running the most up-to-date and stable version of your BIOS. There are beta versions often out there for motherboards. The only time I'd recommend running a beta version is if you're struggling with something on your motherboard or system which is specifically resolved by a beta BIOS, and you just want that in the system as soon as you can in order to help resolve your issue. If not, stick with the stable releases. You don't always have to be jumping on to the next release. If you've got a stable BIOS, you're comfortable with how stuff is working, then honestly, there's no real need to move it along. That's the case for me right now as it happens. 3.16 is the latest version of the BIOS for this motherboard, but all it does is introduce compatibility for a processor, which I'm not running, hence why I am still on 3.15. So always good, every couple of months, do a quick scan of manufacturer's website, see if you're running the latest BIOS. If you're not, take a look at the release notes and just see, is it something that's worth changing, updating? And then if you are struggling with stuttering and you're behind a couple of BIOS versions, it really doesn't help just to move yourself to the latest version. Now, once you've done that and you've got a fresh version of the BIOS on your system, you want to come back into the BIOS. And what I'd always recommend doing is coming over to, I'm not sure what menu it'll be for you. You might have a search functionality, but you want to find the setting, which is, in my case, load UEFI BIOS defaults. It could be called optimized BIOS defaults. Not sure what the name will be on your motherboard, but effectively the setting that will clear the BIOS, load the defaults, give you a fresh start. Normally when you are updating BIOS, it'll wipe the settings anyway, but this is just a good way to make sure that you're starting from absolute fresh as you go through and then make any other configuration changes in the BIOS. You're just starting with a blank slate, which can be a great thing to do, especially if stutters are a problem and you want to just eliminate BIOS issues as being a part of that. The next thing that I'll often take a quick look at, for me this is on my boot menu, is something called Fast Boot, which you can see here is right at the bottom of my screen. Now, I've already done the load UEFI defaults here, and actually Fast Boot would normally be enabled on this system. Now, the description on the right, I'll quickly read it here. It enables or disables boot with initialization of a minimal set of devices required to launch active boot option. So I like to have this disabled because I notice very little difference in boot times between Fast Boot enabled and disabled. But for me, I want to make sure that those set of devices are all fully initialized every time I boot up the computer, just in case any one of those, because of this setting, does not initialize properly or the way that it should. So it's a personal preference, but honestly, I find it makes so little difference to boot times that when I come into the BIOS, I always disable fast boot just again to remove it as a potential point of failure for devices that could ultimately then cause stuttering if they have not been initialized correctly. The next one is something that most of you will be very familiar with, even those of you that don't overclock your system. Anyone that's building their own system or even doing pre-builds will often make sure that the XMP or the EXPO RAM profiles are enabled. This is important to do because otherwise you're not going to get the maximum speed or performance from your RAM. That in itself actually could be a cause of stuttering because it means you're running your system kind of below optimal. Now it's true that in general overclocking a system in any way can introduce instability. And RAM is not immune from that, but so long as you're buying RAM that's compatible with your system, compatible with your motherboard, and is designed to run at speeds that are supported by both the motherboard and the CPU that you have installed, then really this is a very safe overclock. The reason why I say that is because when you take a look at the profiles, and here you can see my DRAM profile configuration, that's where I find this. On your board, you're just looking for EXPO if you're running DDR5 and you're on an AMD platform, or you're looking for XMP if you're running an Intel system. So just always worth double checking that, especially if you update your BIOS, that these RAM profiles are still set. And then if you do have, these set to EXPO or XMP, and you think they could be causing stuttering issues because they're actually set above the JDEC frequency, well, you can come in here and do the reverse. Take off that XMP or EXPO profile, reload into Windows, do a 20-minute race, and see if that does solve the problem. My only hesitation with that is that probably means there's an incompatibility issue with your motherboard and or CPU. So it's unlikely to be a RAM problem unless you just have RAM sticks, and it may be that the RAM just doesn't work well with the system that you currently have. And the last thing to look at, this is a little bit more niche. It's called Global C-State Control, or C-States. That's what you want to look for as you're looking through your RAM. For me, in this ASRock board, it sits under AMD CBS, CPU Common Options, and then you can see here, Global C-State Control. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this, so please do some research into C-State Control, especially with your particular CPU, whether you're Intel, AMD, with your motherboard, just so you have a clear understanding of what it will do and how it will perform with your particular setup. In layman's terms, every CPU core has a number of active states which it can choose to be in. The most obvious one is when it's active and performing tasks. So it's active, consuming power, etc., getting hot, doing things that the computer is asking it to do. It has an idle state where it's sat idle. It's not actually being asked to do anything, but it is ready to go, still getting power, just waiting for an instruction to be sent to it. And then, there are probably some others in between, but there is a C state, which is asleep, basically. And that is great because it reduces power draw to the core, which in turn will also reduce the heat that's being generated by the CPU. But it has a very, very small latency impact when you're waking up that core and then asking it to perform a task. 99% of the time, you'll never notice this. You would never know it was happening. It's all being done. It's highly optimized in the backgrounds. That's excellent. However, it is again another area that latency could potentially show up as a stutter within a game, when you're pushing a CPU pretty hard. So for me, I have this disabled because it's purely a gaming rig. I don't mind a little bit of extra power consumption, a little bit of extra heat generation. I have a really good CPU cooling solution on my rig, so I'm not worried about that. And as I said, because I'm not using the PC for day-to-day tasks, it's always generating quite a bit of heat because I'm in the rig, running races on it. So I have this set to disabled because I just want to reduce anywhere I can reduce latency, I want to take that opportunity. But what this does mean for me, as I said, it's preventing any of my cores, even when they're doing absolutely nothing, from going into a sleep mode, which will increase power consumption and will increase heat. So make the decision here which is best for you. Do the research in terms of how C states work for your particular CPU. There may be specific manufacturer guidance as to how to set this up for yours. In general, they will be set to auto, which will use C states so that they can power down cores when they're not being used. But as I said, if you're really struggling with stutters and you've tried almost everything, this is just another avenue to test, isolate it, come into the BIOS, disable the C state control, go run a 20-minute race and just see, has this made any difference? If not, then you could probably come back, stick it back to auto, or if you're just using it as a gaming rig and you're not too worried about the extra heat or CPU power being generated, then you can do as I do and leave it set to disabled. So moving on to hardware, this is another common area that can cause stutters. Some easy to diagnose, some a little bit more difficult, but let's just talk through some of the most common areas that you can take a look at just to see if it makes a difference for you. So first of all, usually an obvious one, but just worth thinking about, monitor cable quality, and then also just making sure that your cables are plugged in and you don't have a real tight curve on any part of the cable as it's routed from your GPU through to your monitor. So usually the cable quality that you're going to get when you buy a monitor is absolutely fine, so that's great. But if you happen to have bought any third-party monitor cables, maybe you needed a little bit longer cable to make sure it could reach fine, just make sure that it meets the right specifications for the HDMI or display port that you're running on the GPU and on the monitor. You'd be amazed how many of the third-party cables don't actually meet those specifications and may not always result in stuttering, but it can cause a bit of a challenge of the picture quality from GPU to monitor. So double check if you're using third-party cables, and as I said, if you're using the one that comes with your monitor, you should generally be fine. Cable routing can be another important one. I've talked about this in some of my prior videos as well, and specifically when it comes to stuttering, what I would take a look at is just to make sure you are not routing your power cables, especially the ones that are carrying a significant amount of power, maybe your wheelbase, or if you have a motion system, but anything that's particularly power hungry. Just make sure your monitor cables or your data cables are not routed along the whole length of that power cable, because you can get electrical interference across the two. Probably won't impact the power side of things, but it could impact the quality of the data, making it from your PC to a particular peripheral or to your monitor, and that can cause artifacting and just kind of generally mess things up a little bit. So it's quite okay if you've got a power cable running this way and then you cross it with a data cable. You don't have to keep them entirely separate. You can cross them at 90 degrees, absolutely no problem. And sometimes, if you've got to run them side by side for short distances, it should be okay, but where you can, try and route them to different sides of the rig, and when they have to cross, try and do it at 90-degree angles. Next up, USB hubs. Now, when we're sim racing, we've got a ton of USB peripheral devices. I totally get why you may need to have a USB hub for your system. You might have a powered USB hub, which generally seem to be a bit more reliable than the unpowered ones, because of course, each of those USB devices is generally making a call for a degree of power, if not just, pushing a large amount of data through the USB hub. So having a powered one can bring a bit more stability. My general advice is, if you don't have to use a USB hub, then don't. Use the native ports that are on your PC. That's always going to be the better route to go. If you are doing that, but you still feel like there might be a USB issue, it can be as simple as just try to plug different USB devices into different ports, see if that makes a difference. It's likely that the USB ports you have, some will be running at higher speed, some will be running at lower speed. Do a double check in terms of compatibility with your peripherals. See if one might need USB 3 speeds. Check the ones that would only need USB 2 speeds or below and adjust them. USB issues can be a real pain to solve, to be honest, but that can be the basic thing. Is try and use the native ports and then connect them into different native ports if you're struggling with something. Now, if you do have to use a USB hub, again, I'm not an expert here because I don't use one. Do your research, look for the ones that are reliable, and just get an understanding of what is the most stable setup for that USB hub. And in particular, what does the USB hub need to be plugged into? More than likely into a fairly high speed USB port that's on your motherboard, but just do the research. And if you're struggling to find a failure point, but you're still getting the stuttering, just take out all of the unnecessary peripherals from that USB port, plug them in natively, leave the unnecessary ones just unplugged, and then get into a sim session and just see if that does resolve the stuttering. If so, you've narrowed down that it's something to do with the USB port or device, and then you can continue on your investigation there. Wireless USB dongles. Interesting one. This is an issue I struggled with actually for 6 to 9 months. Had no idea that this was causing some of the artifacting and kind of audio blipping in and out that I was getting in my iRacing setup for a long time. I was hunting down stuttering in many other areas and ended up coming back to this as being the issue. The core of this issue is if you have, say, a wireless headset, wireless keyboard, wireless mouse, anything else that's wireless that is using a USB dongle, if they are plugged in to the back of the motherboard, a couple of things. One, they may be quite far from where you're sat in the rig, so therefore the distance has to travel further. There could be things in the way, like screens, like other things, and therefore that can create interruptions in the data, and that can lead to stutters. And secondly, if you've got all of these wireless dongles plugged in next to each other on the motherboard, which is exactly what I had 3 right next to each other, thinking it was super neat and tidy, they are all generating wireless signals, and of course they shouldn't interfere with each other, but when they're right next to each other, there's bound to be a degree of interference, again, in just getting in the way of a clean signal from each USB dongle to the particular peripheral that they are serving. So one option, go fully wired. That's great. I like the wireless accessories I have, keyboard, mouse, headset. I did a couple of things. One, I actually was able to put the keyboard and the mouse on a single dongle, so just to take one dongle out of the equation altogether, so that was handy. But the second thing I did is I always wondered why these wireless dongles came with extender cables, and of course now I know why. You can create a little bit of distance between each of the dongles so that they don't interfere with each other, but most importantly, you can bring the wireless dongle so that it is much closer to you. And so both for my keyboard and my headset, they are now within really a meter of where I'm sitting, and that entirely resolved the audio stutters and who knows what else around data interference that I was struggling with. So super simple one. You've probably already got it covered, but if you don't and you do have wireless dongles pushed next to each other, I highly recommend looking and getting an extender just so that they can be closer to you and you can create some distance between the wireless dongles themselves. Let's take a moment to talk about additional screens. If you're running triples, great. There's no need to be turning any of those off. If you're getting stutters, it does not mean you should be going down to one screen. You want to resolve it, so you still continue with your triple screen setup. However, if you're running a fourth screen, like I am above here, or you're running a digital dash display, which is in effect another screen that's being powered by the PC. These can be points of failure, can be points of stutters, can be things that are just getting in the way of your system setup. Now, I don't run a digital dash, but in my prior setup, when I was running 1440p triples, I was running a fourth screen. And as of yet, I've been able to get the fourth screen to play nice with my triple 4K setup. It's almost certainly possible. Don't get me wrong, I'm running a 4090, it should be fine, but it was impacting frame rates being generated on the triples and limiting me to the refresh rate of the fourth screen monitor when I was playing iRacing, which was extremely frustrating, and I couldn't figure it out. So I have disconnected my fourth screen. I will probably get back to it at some point to try and investigate again if there was something I was missing. But if you're getting stutters or if you're getting weird frame rate issues, like I had, I was capped at the fourth monitor display refresh rate, despite the fact my triples could go much higher than that. So it was very frustrating, and wasn't causing stuttering necessarily, but it was capped at about 70 FPS in game rather than 115, which is what I had set it to within iRacing. So I couldn't figure it out. I just disconnected the full screen for now. Hugely miss it, but I'd rather have smooth gameplay for the time being. So it may not be the cause of your stutters, but just know if you're running a digital dash, if you're running a fourth screen, if you're having stutters, if you've tried many other areas, just disconnect one, get back into the sim race, see how that works. If you're still getting stutters, of course, it's not that, disconnect the full screen, do the same thing. But it's just another avenue worth exploring just to see if that fourth or fifth screen is creating some issue with compatibility or with how the sim is running, especially if you're running triple screens and you're already pushing a lot of frames, through the 3 screens. It can just be a point of failure just to take a look at. This is likely an obvious one because most of us, I know there's a lot of enthusiasts out there building PCs as well as sim racing. I certainly fall into that category. If you're buying pre-builds, this certainly shouldn't be an issue unless you're overclocking your components significantly. But let's talk about PSU or power supply wattage. I am currently got a 1000-watt power supply. That's great. I'm hoping to get my hands on a 5090. Unlikely based on what I'm reading, but should I get a 5090 at some point in 2025, the power requirements for that GPU are an extra, I think, 150 on my 4090 at the moment. So I'm probably going to start to get close to the limit of my power supply. So I need to take a look at that, and I need to think, do I need to jump up to 1200? Is 1000 sufficient? I'll need to take a look at the power draw on my CPU, GPU under load, using probably HWiNFO whilst I'm racing, just to see if I got enough headroom or am I tight. If I'm tight, I'll probably go for a slightly larger power supply. So the general guidance here is just make sure you've got enough headroom, and especially when you're doing hardware upgrades, if you're increasing the wattage draw on the system, just make sure your power supply can handle it. If you're already at an 850 or an 1000, you're probably fine. But if you're pushing triples, if you're running a top-end GPU, power requirements are getting more and more. If you're running, in particular, an Intel CPU, probably anything 12th, 13th, 14th gen, they generally have higher power draw than the AMD equivalents. You might be quite close to hitting that power limit, and if so, your PC might just shut down, because it just kind of runs out of power. But even if you're just up to that limit, it can still create some instability within the game because you don't have much headroom left, and you do get these transient spikes, I think, from GPUs, especially when you're running games or pushing the component pretty hard. So couple of ways you can double check whether you've got a big enough PSU. The one easy way is to use PC Part Picker, put in all your components, and it will spit out a wattage. It won't be perfectly accurate because it doesn't know the conditions you're running your components under, but it'll at least give you a ballpark. You always want to, I would say, have maybe 100 to 200 watts of capacity or headroom, as per PC Part Picker. I think that's a good place to start. And then once you have a power supply installed, let's say you've upgraded your system and you want to check that you are indeed, running at a power level that's appropriate, fire all of your apps up, get into a sim, get a monitoring app running like HWiNFO, make sure it's set to sort of record a report as you're playing, and then just see what power draw there is across all of your components during a typical, let's say, 15 to 20 minute race. Come back to it, take a look, and just see how much headroom do you actually have when you're racing. If it's under 100, might be time to look for a new PSU or turn down an overclock or undervolt your CPU, GPU. There's a number of ways to try and buy yourself back a little bit more headroom in the power. But if you're right at the limit and you are getting stuttering, could be one of the potential causes for that. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And last but not least would be the RAM, or indeed the VRAM, so your GPU RAM capacity. Both of these are quite easy to change, a little bit easier to change your system RAM as they're just individual sticks that you can take out, plug in. And even with DDR5 these days, the cost is not too bad. And 16 to 32 is becoming the new norm. And even the 64 gigabyte kit that I put into my system a couple of weeks ago, I was pleasantly surprised at the price. It was probably less than I was expecting. So that is great. But why is RAM important? RAM capacity in particular. If you are at RAM capacity whilst you're gaming, maybe you only have 16 gigabytes of RAM and you have some companion apps running, maybe you stream at the same time, who knows, but you're pushing the RAM to its limit. Windows doesn't crash if it runs out of RAM, but it uses the SSD or disk drive basically as an alternate way of storing information and then pulling it back. But that is much slower than RAM itself, and therefore that can then show up as stutters in the game. Or if you have a monitoring app in game like iRacing does, it has a page fault meter. This is quite useful because if you're getting a high number of page faults, generally what that's suggesting is that the system is having to use the SSD to pop information and then pull back. And every time it does that, it's creating additional latency. And one of the reasons could be is that it has run out of RAM capacity when you're running your system with kind of all bells and whistles. So it never hurts to have a bit more RAM capacity. There's no particular sweet spot. I don't think. It depends on the games that you're running, the RAM requirements that it has. I've been running 32 gigs of RAM for the last 3 years, I think, been totally fine. I have just moved up to 64 gig, mainly because the price was reasonable when I was looking, and given I'm running 4K triples, I really want to create as much headroom in all of my components as I possibly can. Haven't noticed any real difference from 32 gigs, just to be clear, but if you are running 8 or 16 gig, you are likely going to be tight for space. Windows is, uses more and more RAM, with every Windows update, it seems. Most of the Sims will start to be more demanding in terms of the RAM they want to reserve to run the game with all the fancy textures, etc. So if you can get yourself up to 32 gigs of RAM, not a bad thing to do. As I said, prices are pretty good. It's unlikely you really need to stretch into 64 gigs of RAM. Like, that's really for the more exotic systems, like I said. But something to keep an eye on, especially if you currently have 8 or 16 gig and you're seeing a high number of page faults from the monitoring app that you're using. It could be that it is a RAM capacity issue. Now, as for GPU or VRAM, obviously you have to buy a new video card, which is much more expensive in order to replace that. Again, I don't have a particular area of guidance. It'll depend hugely on whether you're running triples or single screen, or maybe you're running VR. So you're going to have to do the research for your particular system to understand what might be the right level of VRAM for you. Game requirements are going to be very specific, generally around the recommended VRAM versus the minimum VRAM. For a long time, 8 gigabytes of VRAM was considered great, right on, no worries. I would say that's probably increased to sort of 12 gigabytes these days. And with the new 5090, pushing 32 gigabytes of VRAM, who knows, maybe games are going to start to consume more and more of the VRAM as we go. So look at the games that you play, look at the VRAM requirements. Again, you can use a monitoring app whilst you're playing to see how much of your VRAM is being used. And if you've got, 20-30% free, then great, no worries at all. If 90% of that VRAM is being reserved and actually being used, and you're getting stutters, well, maybe that's something else for you to take a look at. But as I said, RAM quite important from a system perspective, but also from a GPU perspective. Look out for page faults. If you're getting a bunch of page faults, certainly take a look at RAM and just see are you capacity constrained, and if so, it might be time for an upgrade there. Outside of adjusting BIOS settings, adjusting graphics settings in the sim, one of the places I almost always go to look for first, if I've got any increase in stuttering or something that's unexpected, is to dive into a bunch of areas within Windows. A little earlier in the video, I talked about the different monitoring apps or applications that I go and take a quick look at just to see if they provide any indicators. They don't always. Sometimes everything can be shown as running as normal. But I do have a bit of a hit list that I will get after just to, again, rule things out in terms of them being the cause of stuttering in Windows. You know, it's great, but it's complex. Windows 11 especially, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And so just working through, this is just my checklist, I'm sure there'll be other things that could be added, but working through this list I find can just help make sure the system is running as stable as it can be. So let's start with system health. And there's a few areas that I'll take a look at. The most obvious one, which most of the time we don't need to worry about, would be Windows Update. Obviously, you're most likely have this set up so that it's just updating in the background, doing its thing. 90% of the time, that's going to be great. There are occasions when particular updates either have a beneficial effect for gaming or have a negative effect for gaming. You don't need to keep obviously up to date with every security bulletin and to know what's what, but it does pay to be somewhat active on tech sites, just so you can get a flavor for if there's a big update coming for Windows 11, Windows 10, that you have an idea if it has any particular positive or negative impact on gaming. There was a particularly big update for Windows 11 in the sort of fall, early winter last year, and it was a positive impact. Moving to 24H2 update package actually brought some gains in terms of FPS, so that was pretty cool. But first thing to do, run Windows Update manually. If you think it's been a while, let it pull the latest information, just so you know that Windows is running as up to date with the most stable release as it can be. Now, second would be driver updates. Sometimes Windows just looks after that for you. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not such a good thing. But just like when you're building a new PC, it never hurts just to take a look at, current driver updates, just to make sure you're running the latest. Or again, just like Windows, perhaps you've got an NVIDIA graphics card and there's a particular update for the driver software that maybe is having a negative impact. Again, Reddit is a site I use all the time, stay active on AMD and NVIDIA forums, just to try and stay in the know about latest driver updates, positive, negative. A lot of people put a lot of their time into reviewing them, getting understanding of the impacts to various games, so there's just a wealth of information out there. But in terms of driver updates, just quick fire, where would you look? Let me just fire up a browser window here, and I'll show you the ones that I have in my favorites, kind of the key areas that I will look at. I've got an AMD chipset, so one of the first things I'll do is drop into the AMD, this is my board, X670E drivers and support. Now I haven't checked this for a bit, but indeed I'm still running this latest revision number. It was last updated 21st of October last year. So chipset drivers for your motherboard, somewhere I would always go and take a look at. So that's kind of my first port of call. I will then go to the motherboard manufacturer itself, in my case ASRock, and I will have a look here. I won't usually get the chipset drivers from here. I usually go direct to AMD for that. They tend to have the more up-to-date drivers, I typically find. But for all of the other devices that are on the motherboard, so we've got audio, Bluetooth, Thunderbolt, WLAN, LAN, all of this other stuff. You can go and get the generic packages and the generic drivers, but I always think from a motherboard perspective, outside of the chipset, which I'd always go directly to AMD or Intel for, I would come to the motherboard support page and pull the drivers that they are recommending specifically for their motherboard, because they may implement a particular piece of hardware in a certain way, and therefore the driver they have supporting it could be slightly different to the standard. So yes, chipset first, then take a look at the motherboard drivers, make sure you're kind of up to date on all of those areas. Next for me, and usually, honestly, I do this on Reddit, but I'll just jump straight to NVIDIA. And in fact, you know what? I'll just pull up the NVIDIA app for you, a little bit easier. So I run an NVIDIA graphics card. This app, I have it set to alert me if there's a driver update, but to not automatically install. So I have an option whether to install it or not. And as it happens, I'm actually running a driver currently that is one version old. And that's because this 566.36 didn't get rave reviews on the NVIDIA Reddit subreddit. So I've decided to hold off from that because it didn't seem to be providing any particular benefits for the for iRacing or the games that I'm running. So I am actually on the prior driver, so I'm going to wait until they have the new drivers, which no doubt will release shortly in time for the 50 series graphics cards. But yes, coming back to drivers for your GPU can often be super important as well. Once you're comfortable that you're running latest drivers, all the Windows updates, everything feels like it's running well. Something else that I like to do, actually a couple of things that I like to do. Basically a couple of programs that you can run built into Windows that just check the health really of your Windows install. Don't typically take too long to run, and there's only two of them that I think really provide the most value. To run them, you can just just open a command prompt. You'll need to run it as an administrator, as I'm doing here. The first one that I normally run, sfc /scan_now. I'm not actually going to run it right now. It only takes about 30 seconds on my PC. With slower processors can take a little bit longer. But as you can see here from Tom's guide, basically this is a system file checker, and it's basically just going to do a sweep of everything, repair any system files that it finds are corrupted, and if it can't repair anything, then it will just spit out a log file for you to go and take a look at, and you can see how severe it is and if there's anything more serious to take a look at. Quite often I will find that it does find errors. I run this maybe every couple of months just when I'm thinking about it. Usually it just fixes those errors itself, so nothing to worry about. If it finds errors and it says, hey, I can't actually fix all the errors that I found, I'm not an expert in terms of what the errors are, but the other thing that I'll typically then do is put this command in, so DISM /online /image /restore health. This basically is going to restore the health of your Windows image, which can be useful. If you don't want to jump straight into the restore health, there's a few other things you can do in advance of that, as you can see here. This first command, which is the same precursor but is check health, this is basically just going to do a quick sweep of the system and see if there is any corrupted data. You can also use the command scan health, and this is going to identify the specific file corruptions. So I'm not an expert on the DISM or, to be honest, really the sfc scan now function, but I do often find that the sfc one will find errors, will fix it, and if there's any that it can't fix, I will jump in and I'll run one or more of these commands around the kind of clean up image, check health, or restore health, just to make sure that the Windows image that is on the disk and active is as healthy as possible. Onto parked cores, and if you've watched the earlier part of this video where we were talking about monitoring software, I did briefly cover this, but I will try and go into a little bit more detail in this section. So let's say your system's all healthy, all good, stuttering still a problem. You've come across this thing called parked cores. You want to get an understanding of, does your system park CPU cores? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's worth spending a little bit of time just to get into this. Now, it is certain that this could be a cause of stuttering. Simple fact being that if your system is parking cores, but actually those are cores that would be beneficial to support the game you're running, and they shouldn't therefore be parked because you want maximum performance, then yeah, if they're parked, they could be causing stuttering because that's not the right behavior. However, you've got to be a little bit careful here because it does depend on the CPU that you're running, and this can apply to both Intel and AMD in terms of whether parked cores are actually a good thing or indeed whether they're a bad thing for your setup. I know more about the AMD side, so I'm going to give you the context from an AMD processor perspective. But if you have an Intel CPU, it is worth doing the research for your particular CPU. There'll be performance cores, there could be efficiency cores, and there will be recommendations around how core parking should work for the particular style of CPU that you have. Let's take the AMD example though, and let's start with my particular processor, 9800 X3D. it has one CCD, so one collection of cores, and therefore that one selection of cores has the X3D cache built on top of it. So they all have access to use that cache. So in some ways, it's a fairly simple die. For gaming, simple. You want all of those cores active. You don't want them parked. They can all access the cache. Whichever ones are pulled on when they're needed are good to go. And you don't want them to be parked because then you're just losing processor power. I don't have a problem with heat, in terms of my cooling solution. So for me, I want to make sure that all of my cores are indeed unparked. We're in Resource Monitor, and if you go to the CPU tab, you can see all of the CPU cores on the right-hand side. You can see their current usage, and even though CPU 2, 3, 4, 5, there's not much happening, they are active. You can see if they were parked, they would be grayed out, and they would say parked next to them. So Resource Monitor can show you that pretty quickly. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom of the cores, all of them are indeed active, even though the system is not under full load. So that's good. That's the behavior that I want. I come into Resource Monitor to check just to make sure that nothing has changed if I do a Windows update or do any major hardware, software changes. However, if you have an AMD CPU and it has two CCDs and it's an X3D model, well, the way they're designed is only one of those CCDs will have access to that cache. So, of course, the one you want to be, the cores that you want to use for the game are the ones that have access to the cache, because that's where you're going to get the greatest performance. So what the chipset drivers should do is actually park the cores on the non-X3D cache, the non-X3D cache, set of cores, so that all of the gaming is done by the cores that are on the other CCD, can make the most of the cache that's available and are not having to kind of do any transfers from one CCD to another, which can cause latency issues. So in some cases, having no park cores is the right solution, and that is certainly in my case. But there are other cases where actually parking cores is also a benefit to performance, and it all comes down to the architecture of your CPU. So core parking, definitely an interesting one for stuttering, can definitely be a cause, but make sure you understand the best core parking behavior for your CPU before you come in here, look at it, and then try and make any changes from whatever the default is, because the default might be right, whether it's parking cores or not, but just do double check that. Onto power profiles. This is a more recent rabbit hole that I have headed into, especially Windows 11, because it's a bit more complex, or there's an extra layer, it seems, compared to Windows 10. And it's not all that different, I guess, to the thinking around parked cores. Depending on the process that you're running, there may be an optimum way to have the power plan set in Windows in order to get the maximum performance. That's key from a gaming perspective. Pretty much always, it's never going to be to have it set to the efficiency power plan, because that's going to restrict performance for the CPU. So I've never really seen that. But it's not always simple picking between the balanced and the high performance power plan. I've been through a few generations of AMD CPU, and the guidance I have found has never been super clear whether balanced is the right power plan for maximum gaming performance, or whether high performance is better. So as with parked cores, do the research for your specific CPU, get onto the forums, the places that you trust with tech information, and just try and learn a little bit about how your processor works. Maybe it has specific power plans that are not Windows standard, that kind of come with the CPU that you need to load in separately. That is certainly something that I've seen in the past as well. But just so that you get a sense of where to go looking for power plans, just so you know what's what, I can show you Windows 11, head into System, head into Power. And the reason I say this is a bit more complex now in Windows 11 than Windows 10 is that you can adjust power plans within the settings menu here. And you see I've got three options basically here: best power efficiency, balanced, and best performance. I typically run with best performance because I do want Windows. I don't want Windows restricting, or adding unnecessary sort of limits anywhere in terms of power consumption, etc. I've done a ton of research in terms of how Windows performs and what it does between balance and best performance. I'm still not 100% clear, to be honest. I find this space quite confusing in terms of how Windows operates. Obviously, in basic terms, it should allow for higher performance if you're on best performance, but I suspect these power modes probably have a much bigger influence when you're running on a laptop, when of course efficiency and power saving makes a much bigger difference. But this is the first place to look. Make sure you're not on power efficiency, because that for sure is going to restrict the power and it's going to cause lower performance, therefore could cause stuttering. But if you're on balance and everything's working fine, then that's all good. But if you are struggling with stuttering, you could switch it to best performance, see if that helps. That's something to look at. Now, the reason this is a little bit more complicated is because we still have the old school control panel in Windows 11. If we go to System and Security, we go down to Power Options. Confusingly, you now have 3 more power plans. So we are imbalanced at the moment, and the balance power plan, if we go back to this settings menu and I take us back into power, within the balance power plan you then have still 3 options. You have best performance, balanced, and best power efficiency, which is why I find this quite confusing. So that's why I put mine at best performance, because in control panel we're set at balance, but then if that's a balanced power plan, I really do want it to make the most of that, so I stick it to best performance there. But you can go even more aggressive and you can just go straight to high performance in Windows control panel, and to see if that makes any difference. I could not tell you if high performance in the control panel versus the best performance power plan in the settings menu makes any meaningful difference. Do some research. Some people have gone into this in quite a lot of depth. I found it really challenging to get the true answer here, but these are the areas to play around with. Again, make sure you're not in power saver. I would say that's definitely not going to help you out when you're gaming, but you do have this choice here between balanced and high performance. And if, again, you're struggling, you're getting stutters, and you want to try and rule out the power plans, power options as a potential issue, then switch the power plan to high performance, run a sim, do 20 minutes, see if that helps at all. But it is quite confusing. You can hit change plan settings. You can get into this in a ton more detail. I'm definitely not an expert at power plans, but I just want you to know that it's an area worth looking into, just in case your system is set up on power efficiency, which it shouldn't. It's most likely set to balance, but it is an area to spend a bit of time on, just to take a look. And as I said, understanding whether there is a recommended power plan from AMD or Intel for your specific processor can help, because if there is, and that should support the best usage of the CPU when you're gaming, then that's going to generally be the right power plan to select. Another piece of advice when it comes to apps is, beyond the companion apps that you have running for your sim, could be something to do with the fuel, could be overlays, could be a crew chief, whatever it might be, the ones that you consider mandatory whilst you're racing. Just double check what are the apps you have running in the background that you may be aware of or you may not be aware of. And some of the ones to think about, to take a look at, might be keyboard companion apps. Do you need that running? RGB companion apps. Do you need those running and installed all the time? What about a headset app? Do you have that running and installed? Is it essential? My policy has always been, with this particular sim rig, is to have as little applications installed and running as possible, just to go with the absolute bare minimum. So yes, I have a Logitech keyboard. I could, of course, be running their Logitech app. No real benefit. It's not a first-person shooter. I don't really use the keyboard for anything other than just basic stuff. And I could do more with the lights on the keyboard, I'm sure, if I had their app installed, but it's just taking up memory, taking up a little bit of CPU. Not something I need to have in. Same with my headset app. I will occasionally install it just so I can keep the firmware up to date in the headset. but I don't need it fully integrated. I don't need it running. I don't even really need it installed. So I think the last rebuild I did of Windows on this PC, I didn't put on the headset app either. So that's the advice: is if you need them installed, great. Then make a decision whether you need them running whilst you are in the sim, and if you do, okay, all good. But then, if you have them installed, just make sure if they are running in the background, even if you don't need them to be. Good way to double check that would be go to your startup apps and just have a quick look through the list and just see, well, which apps actually are starting when I boot up Windows, and am I in control of those, and are they the apps that I want to be running? So you can see for me, OneDrive, no thank you. Mobile devices, phone links, these are Windows things. I don't use them, so I just have them off. I don't need those starting up. And then you can see the obvious ones that I use for me: the SIMUQ2, Wheelbase, app, need that up and running, so I just have it starting up. Trading Paint, and then the Garage 61 launcher. So I'm not saying don't run the companion apps, run the ones you need to run, but just make sure that everything that is running whilst you're in the sim are ones you absolutely need. And if you're on the fence, like a keyboard app or whatever, or it's not providing a ton of value, just ask yourself the question: do I really need this to be active whilst I'm running the game? And if not, honestly, I don't have to necessarily install it, but maybe get it out of your startup programs. But if you really don't use the app, just kill it altogether, and just don't have it running. So as I said, my philosophy is less is more when it comes to apps on kind of gaming PCs, just to keep things running as cleanly as possible. And then again, as always, really around stutters, just reduce the amount of areas that could cause that stutter or cause that failure point. Third-party apps certainly fall into that category. And this should be a bit of an obvious one, but it's easy to miss, or it's easy to make an assumption that the refresh rate for your monitor has been picked up by Windows and is indeed running at the right refresh rate, but you never know. You do a rebuild of Windows, you have a new PC, you get a new monitor. It's super easy to miss stuff like this. But head into settings, head into system, head into display. You can see here I've got my triple screens. And as I said, seems simple, but just make sure, and you can go to advanced display to check this, just make sure that the refresh rate that Windows is set to is the right one for your monitor, or in my case, for my 3 monitors. So here I've got 3 monitors connected. They're all identical, so I can do display 1, display 2, display 3. You can see it's 120 Hertz for each one. Now, in my case, 120 Hertz is actually half of each of these monitors' potential refresh rate. However, I am limited by what my 4090 can put out. It can only put out 240 Hertz on one of these 3 screens. The other 2 would have to be 120, so I run all 3 at 120 Hertz to keep it simple. If I can get my hands on a 5090, that will change, so I will probably push these all up to 240, which is lovely. But it's super basic, but just make sure that Windows is running at the right refresh rate for your monitors, that it can see the different refresh rates that are available, and usually there's a fairly big selection. As you can see, mine goes up to the 239.97 all the way down to the 23.98. And if you have multiple monitors, just take the time to click through each one, make sure it's set the right way here. If you have the refresh rate in Windows set to something which is not the maximum refresh rate that your monitor is capable of, it can just lead to jitters, unsmooth kind of gameplay, and just create visual inconsistencies from what it should be. As I said, you'll often be able to select from this drop down, and it's more going to be just to make sure that you're getting the best refresh rate that your monitors can provide to you. But just make sure, especially with multiple screens, that they're running at the same refresh rate, everything's solid, and is looking the way that it should. Okay, a couple of other quick ones before we close out of this Windows section. First of all, file syncing software. Windows loves OneDrive. Generally, will start OneDrive. It'll install it whether you like it or not. It generally runs on startup whether you like it or not. It kind of drives me wild. I do actually use OneDrive as my backup, but I don't have it running all of the time when my PC is running. And I've actually, you can see here, I've turned it off from an auto startup perspective, just so that, you know, I'm happy to turn OneDrive on, but I want it on when I want it on. Now, you might want yours running all the time in the background, and that's fine. Just know that if you're running with file syncing software and it's active whilst you're sim racing, then it is generally making frequent writes to your hard drive. Generally speaking, it's probably fine, but if you don't need that to be happening whilst you're racing, you know, why not take that out as a point of failure or point of area that could cause additional page faults, which could potentially result in stutters in the game. So as I said, OneDrive annoys me, but I do have it installed. I do use it, but I have it set to off at startup, and then I just trigger it as and when I need it, and certainly either have it paused or turned off whilst I'm racing. And the last one here will be Internet Explorer, web browser, Microsoft Edge, Firefox, Google Chrome, whatever web browser you are using. These can be a little bit of a resource hog if you have them open and running whilst you're gaming. So first piece of advice would be, don't have them running whilst gaming unless you absolutely need to. Maybe you use them for some sort of overlay or something like that. And if you do, totally fine, but just know they do have a tendency to hold on to a lot of RAM whilst they're open, because that enables them to run a little bit faster, and fast web browsers, of course, all the rage. But let's just, and again, I only have Edge installed, so I'm just going to give you the Edge example. But even if you don't have Edge running, which I don't usually when I'm racing, you'd be amazed at some of the performance settings that are in there that could potentially still impact performance, even when the browser's not running. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to go into settings, I'm going to go into system and performance. And whilst these settings are all set to off right now, startup boost, continue running extensions when Edge is closed, use graphics acceleration when available, by default those three are switched on. And what does that mean? Well, startup boost, that probably means it's going to use a bit of RAM, and it probably means that this is doing something in the background, even if Edge is not actually open as it is now. Continue running background extensions and apps when Microsoft Edge is closed. So if you do have extensions that are running and you close down Edge before you start a race, just know those extensions and apps could still be, taking up a bit of CPU or taking up a bit of RAM whilst you're gaming. So again, I have that set to off. And then use graphics acceleration when available. This, I think, is a bit more of an optional thing. I have this turned off, not just for Edge, actually, for any other companion apps that want to use the GPU whilst I'm gaming. I have this switched to off because my GPU is absolutely maxed out because of the 4K triples that I run, and I don't want any other calls going to the GPU whilst I'm racing at all, or as minimum as I can get it. And I certainly don't want Microsoft Edge making any calls to the GPU for whatever reason whilst I'm racing. So I always turn graphics acceleration off as well. Similar settings like these, they'll be different, but they will exist in Firefox and will exist in Chrome. And I'm not suggesting everything needs to be off like I have it here, but do your research in terms of what these performance settings do for the browser. Pay close attention to the ones that might be taking up system resources even when the app is not running. And if you do need to have a web browser open whilst you're racing, all good. Just make sure you understand what it's doing and what resources it could be taking, because you might just have one tab open, but maybe you've got a bunch of extensions and apps, and maybe they are taking up precious RAM, a little bit of CPU performance, etc., etc. So again, just good housekeeping. Have a look at your web browsers, understand the performance settings, make sure you know what they do. And if it's something that you don't need, then I would just switch them off, certainly while you're racing, or as I've done here, I kind of have them switched to off all of the time. iRacing has a option here called replay spooling, and you can kind of read what it does at the bottom there. I do run with this ticked, but there was a period of time for the last month or so when I've been unticking this just to see if it would get rid of a particular stutter that I'd noticed in some of my longer races. There's a really good description of replay spooling on an iRacing support document. It will be linked in the description below the video. But in essence, especially if you're running long races, iRacing will run out of RAM in order to store the replay in, so it starts to write it to your hard drive. Shouldn't be a problem. Usually it's totally fine. You know, it's a shame if you don't have it, because you get to the end of the race and you can only see the last kind of 10 laps or whatever, so it's a bit of a pain. So generally, you know, you should run with this ticked, but even iRacing themselves state that in longer races, you know, in certain scenarios, if you have replay spooling ticked, it can create more page faults, and as you get more page faults, the page faults can then be they can introduce stutters into the game. So generally you should probably have this ticked, but it's just another potential point of failure, especially in longer endurance races. So you could try just unticking this, running some races, seeing if that improves things. But as I said, be aware, in anything other than a 20-minute race, you won't get the full replay saved because it's using RAM, but it only uses a limited amount of RAM to store the replay. And once that's full, you just lose the earlier part of the replay. So just something to be aware of. All right, so that is a wrap on this one. If you've watched from start to finish, thank you for sticking with it. Hopefully, if you are struggling with stutters, that might have helped you reduce them, eliminate them. And ideally, if nothing else, it's just giving you a little bit of an education of where to look, even if right now, you know, your gameplay is super smooth and you've got nothing to worry about. You know, we have 50 series GPUs just around the corner, new set of AMD GPUs about to be released as well. And I know a bunch of you are still trying to get your hands on the latest 9800 X3D. So there's always changes. Windows is changing all the time, new updates, alter stuff. iRacing is constantly going through software enhancements as well. So as much as I'd love for this to be a one and done on stutters, the video and where to look for, it probably won't be. There'll be new things that I learn over the course of 2025, and who knows, we might pop up before the end of the year and do another kind of take on stutters and see if there's any new information out there, anything new that I've learned since this video. My guidance to you is take a long-term view on stutters. Don't assume one element from one YouTuber is going to solve your stutter and that's it forever. We all have different systems, they're all configured differently, we all run them differently. So the reality is the best way to get a hold of stutters is to understand what can cause them, and then honestly you've just got to take the time. You've got to try and look through each component, be it software, be it hardware, try to isolate it, try to test it, see if it makes a difference. If it doesn't, park it, move on to the next one. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.